Welcome to today's Skeleton Key Study Group webinar. I am so happy you've joined us today for this conversation about Joseph Campbell's book, Pathways to Bliss, and the new study guide that the Campbell Foundation has just published to accompany the book. The Joseph Campbell Foundation invites you to experience the power of myth. So if you hear that call to adventure, you are in the right place. The name of this webinar comes from one of Joseph Campbell's early books, which was called A Skeleton Key to Finnegan's Wake. The book was a guide to reading James Joyce's novel, Finnegan's Wake. We are using that reference to skeleton keys as the name of our new series of study guides for books by Joseph Campbell. So, for example, Pathways to Bliss, a skeleton key study guide, accompanies Campbell's book, Pathways to Bliss. These study guides are intended to companion you as you read Campbell's work, perhaps find yourself inspired by his ideas, and maybe carry them forward in your own way. My name is Joanna Gardner, and I am the series editor for the Skeleton Key Study Guides. I feel so fortunate to have the author of the Pathways to Bliss study guide with us today, our own Dr. Bradley Olson. The two of us will have a conversation, then we'll have some time for Q&A, so feel free to send us your questions via that Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom screen anytime at all. And we do have a promo code to share with you today, so try, if you can, to resist the temptation to do any book shopping until the end of the webinar. Before we go on, though, I would like to introduce some of the intrepid JCF team who are here with us today, making this webinar possible. So let me just share my screen super fast. I say super fast, and then we see how long it takes. Okay, great. We have with us today the brilliant Stephanie Zachowski, our operations coordinator. We also have the amazing Dylan Treadwell, who serves as our intellectual property counsel. We have the one and only Stephen Geringer, our community coordinator and the author of the book Myth and Modern Living, and myself, the study guide series editor and director of marketing and communications. So with that, I will invite the team to say hello and introduce themselves. Stephanie, would you like to lead us off?
Sure thing. Yes. Good morning, everyone. I'm so excited that y'all are here with us today. I am very much looking forward to this conversation that we're going to have. I'm the operations coordinator. I do all the work in the background that helps JCF kind of keep rolling. So thanks for being here. Looking forward to it.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Steph. And thank you for wearing a jacket that matches the cover of the study guide. I think that's that extra je ne sais quoi. Dylan, how about you?
Hey everyone, it's great to see everyone from around the world. We've got people from Brazil and Italy and of course the United States as well. And it's just so encouraging to me to see a global community come together today. So that's what I'm excited for. Can't wait to hear from Brad. As the Intellectual Property Counsel, mainly what I do is help protect Joseph Campbell's works across the United States and the globe. And it's just such an honor and a privilege to be able to be a part of that legacy. And so I'm so excited to be here. Thank you all.
Thank you, Dylan. Stephen.
Well, hello. I have been with the Joseph Campbell Foundation for 20 years now, and I guess I'm the geriatric of the group. Most of that time, everything I've done has revolved around community. So an opportunity for us all to come together, even on a weekend, and discuss myth, that does my heart good.
Thank you so much, Stephen. Thank you to the whole team for those intros and for making today's webinar possible. This is a great time to open up the chat, everyone, if you haven't already. And let's hear a round of virtual applause for Stephanie and Dylan and Stephen and everything they do for the work of myth. Thank you so much. And while you have the chat open, let's take this opportunity for a chat check-in. Let us know where you're zooming in from if you haven't already, and let's bring some myth into the space. So my invitation to you is to think of a mythic figure, any mythic figure that comes to mind, and don't put them into the chat, but put something in the chat that is associated with that figure. So like if I thought of Poseidon, I might type into the chat trident, or I might type ocean, right? So type where you're zooming in from, and then something associated with the first mythic character who comes to mind. I'm joining today from the Santa Barbara area, and I guess I'll go with ocean. That would be what I would type into the chat if I were typing. Dylan, do we have any other mythic images popping into the chat?
Yes, a flute, a lightning bolt, sacred groves,
Sacred Grove,
the Grail.
lightning bolt, Grail, did you say?
Yes.
Nice. Awesome. Thank you. So welcome to all of these mythic symbols that are joining us today. I can kind of feel them hovering in the air with us, and we'll be talking about myth, metaphor, and symbol. So thank you so much for bringing those into the space with us. Okay, before I introduce today's guest of honor, I just want to tell you a little bit more about what these study guides are. Skeleton keys can open many locks, right? Because they have been filed down to just the essentials. A skeleton key study guide works the same way. We designed these books to help teachers and students and creatives and book clubs and really all myth-minded readers to discover Campbell's insights and experience the power of myth. And we hope that includes you. You'll find concise chapter summaries of Campbell's chapters, plus reading lists and prompts for discussions, essay topics, and creative projects. This is what the cover of the Pathways to Bliss study guide looks like. And this is one of those insights of Campbell's that the study guide discusses. Eternity is not future or past. Eternity is a dimension of now. It is a dimension of the human spirit, which is eternal. And so here are what some of the pages inside the study guide look like. This is the beginning of one of my favorite chapters of this study guide, Myth and the Self. I just love what Brad did with this chapter. You can see it begins with this chapter summary, and I'm going to page forward a little bit so you can see what it looks like when a quote is called out. This is one of the quotes that Brad selected to highlight, and I'll just read it quickly. Now, typically, all these archetypes come out personified in myths and dreams. We personify the mystery of the universe as God. And so paging forward, this shows some of the points of interest that Brad wrote for this chapter. There's a section here at the bottom on the left on Freud and Jung, a section on the collective unconscious, the boon of the shadow, degendering the anima, fascinating. And this last section here, intolerable decisions and moral development. Really a great chapter. And I'm so grateful to Brad for writing it. Then at the end of the chapter, you see we get into the reading lists, the discussion questions, and essay topics and creative prompts, right? And so now I hope you're getting a sense of why it gives me great joy to introduce you to Dr. Bradley Olson. Brad, come on up to the virtual front of this virtual room while I read your bio very quickly. Brad Olson, PhD, a former police officer, is now a writer and depth psychologist in private practice in Flagstaff, Arizona. Dr. Olson serves as the publications director at the Joseph Campbell Foundation, where he also edits and contributes to the popular Myth Blast series and hosts the Foundation's flagship podcast, Pathways with Joseph Campbell. For more about Dr. Olson's Myth Blasts, podcasts, and professional activities, visit jcf.org and Brad's personal website, bradleyolsonphd.com. Let's hear some virtual applause for Brad in the chat. And with that, I will stop the slide share so that we can begin our conversation. Welcome to the webinar, Brad. How are you today?
Well, I'm great. Thank you, Joanna.
Awesome. So let's jump right in. My first question for you, this is our third webinar that we've done, and I ask similar but not identical questions each time, but I would like to start out with a little bit of your myth origin story. Wondering if you could share with us what first drew you to myth.
I come to myth through literature. When I was an undergraduate in college, I studied literature and psychology, majored in both of them. And there was a marvelous literature department at this very small state college that I went to. And I was introduced to the classics, Sophocles and Aeschylus and, all of that stuff, and just fell in love with it. And so I've always read myth in some ways, whether it's Homer or, the Greek playwrights, that kind of thing. But it wasn't until probably the early 90s, I think. I'd finished school and I was working as a psychologist in Phoenix, and I heard, that public television was always trotting out the power of myth at every fundraising cycle. And so I heard that for the first time, the interview with Bill Moyers that Campbell did. And it really struck me. And that was my introduction to Campbell. And it made me think about myth in an entirely different way, not as necessarily literature, but as therapy. And that's where it all began.
And here we are today, right?
Right.
Thank you for sharing that. Yeah, that's a lot of people found Campbell through the power of myth, including myself. And it's so interesting the many ways people find the power of myth, a PBS fund drive or what have you. Okay, great. So let's go on to the second question, which is what, in your opinion, is the most important reason to study myth?
Well, I think that myth is a mode of thinking. I'm less concerned with the narratives of myth than I am. And then this is the beautiful thing about myth, is that there's room for all these different perspectives, and often there's competing or even conflicting viewpoints and all that stuff. And myth is large enough to hold all of that. And that's one of the things I really enjoy about it. But I find primarily for me, myth is a form of communication. It makes a statement. It communicates what it is to be a human being. And I think that in most of myth, what we learn is that being a human being is very difficult. And there's some consolation in this understanding that I'm not in this alone, that since the dawn of human history, we've been struggling with this business of being human. And the myths sort of support us in that struggle. And they tell us that, I know it's hard and things don't work out the way you want them to, and all of that. And yet, there's a great deal of beauty to be found in myth, in life, in one's own struggles even. And so I find that myths are quite consoling, and they do open the door to beauty. I think that that's a very important thing. I think that's really the most therapeutic experience. And I think therapists, in one way or another, we're sort of, we share that goal in our work with people, is to help people discover the beauty that is in their own life. So I think that, I'm reminded that Nietzsche used to go everywhere with a notebook in his pocket. And in one of his notebooks, he had written, we have art so that we don't die of the truth. And I think that's another place where myth serves a very important function. This mythopoetic impulse.
The mythopoetic impulse. Thank you so much for that. Myth is a mode of thinking, and a form of communication, and it opens the door to beauty. And I agree completely with your observation about, myth's ability to console, that sense of the narratives and the characters companioning the reader, the viewer, as we go through our own mythic lives, right?
Yeah, Aeschylus, for instance, in Agamemnon, he tells us that we must suffer our way into truth, and that's that's what happens, and it makes it hard to do that if we're constantly resisting the conditions of life as they are. And so having this acceptance for things as they are is really important, and that allows us to turn the suffering into learning.
Turn the suffering
pathos,
into learning.
We go from pathos to mythos, from
Wait, sorry, say that again. From pathos to what?
mythos,
Pathos,
which is
okay.
learning.
That word, I thought you were saying a new word I didn't know. I was going to be like, wait, I have to learn that. It's from pathos to pathos. So what you're sharing is just leading like exactly perfectly into my next question, which is, one of the unique things about your study guide is the expertise that you bring to it as a therapist. There's actually two really important, unique things about your study guide that I want to call out. And that is, like I say, the expertise that you bring as a mythologist and a therapist to this work. And also what I consider your profound insight that you develop in the introduction about the importance of modernism to Campbell's work. And you make the point, I think, that to understand Campbell, we need to understand modernism. And so kind of bringing those together, my question is, are we looking at a modernist form of psychology here in Pathways to Bliss? And if so, how do you relate that to people today? In what some people are calling a time of meta-modernism, right? We're after postmodernism now. One of the proposed names for this time that we're currently inhabiting is meta-modernism. And so would love to hear your thoughts about connecting modernism to the practicalities of psychology today.
Yeah. Well, this is a great question. I really appreciate you coming up with this question, because let's deal with Campbell first. He was born in 1904. He was born in the suburbs of New York City. This was one of the, along with Paris, this was the epicenter of modernism. And so it was sort of in the air that he was breathing. And, he was, a bright, well-read kid. And he tells the story of being, gosh, I don't know how old he was, 6, maybe, something like that. And he recalls being on Riverside Drive with his father and watching Wilbur or Orville, one of the Wright brothers, flying over Riverside Drive. And so there's all this newness everywhere in this time period. Art and literature are radically different than they were in the previous era of realism. Now we're moving into a place where the interiority of not just oneself but of things is really valued. And you start to see surrealistic art and abstract art becoming more and more and more profound and popular. Literature changes drastically with Thomas Mann, with James Joyce, with Virginia Woolf, and it becomes this less formal, more open to interiority than, say, some of the mid-19th century literature. You get more stream of consciousness, you get more of a focus on the beauty that emanates out of things rather than the structural beauty of things. And this is really revolutionary. Now, I think as to postmodernism and metamodernism and all of that, that's a hard concept for me, because I think we're always in some way modernists, and we run into this too with other theories, like people talk about post-Jungian theory, or they talk about Wolfgang Giegerich as a post-Jungian, or maybe even Hillman as a post-Jungian. But I think that's not actually correct, because they're still elaborating the work of Jung. And so they're still in that field of Jungian thought and theory. So, and I kind of feel that way about modernism, postmodernism, and all of that stuff. Now, I think it can be a useful shorthand often. And postmodernism, particularly some of the work of Jacques Derrida and Michel Foucault, these guys are really unpacking some important ideas about narrative form, and what is included and what's excluded, and what is lost and what is gained by reading between the lines, and all of that stuff. And of course, Foucault's meditations on power and all of that stuff are extraordinary. So Campbell then grows up in this modernist atmosphere. He recognizes it almost immediately. He goes to Paris with his parents when he's a young man, and is captivated by the art that's happening there.
Can you imagine?
Yeah, Hemingway writes in A Movable Feast that Paris is so extraordinarily beautiful that it satisfies something in you that always stays hungry in America.
Oh, wow.
So
Would
there's
you say that again? Paris is so beautiful
that it satisfies something in you that always remains hungry in America.
That guy's good, right?
So Campbell has this experience, I think. And this is one of the things that really inspires his outlook on life, this business of beauty. And you can see that in his writing, I think. And his writing is one of the ways that I really became more fond of Campbell, because of the way he wrote in that very modernist style that was kind of idiosyncratic, and yet had this attention to beauty.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And he ends up hanging out with people like Martha Graham and Cage, the composer, that radical composer. It was extraordinarily brilliant. And Krishnamurti, he befriends on the boat to Paris, and they have a long friendship. And in a way, he's a little bit like Forrest Gump in some ways. He runs into extraordinary figures. So He's influenced by literature. I think he probably wanted to be a writer of fiction. We have a collection, in the collected works of some of his short stories. And it's interesting to look at them just from the perspective of the way that he's thinking about literature and the way that he's thinking about himself as a writer. And, a lot of these are written when he's younger, and he didn't have a lot of success there. And we're probably better off for that. Which brings me to another point about modernism and this business of failure becomes a much more interesting subject. William Faulkner, for instance, always thought of himself as a failed poet, but yet he wins the Nobel Prize for literature. So the idea of failure becomes a little bit different in modernist literature. We're let into that experience, again, because of that influence of interiority. But we're also showed that failure isn't a dead end, that it's more of a course correction. And often the failures that we have in one area move us into another area that we're better suited for, or perhaps where our destiny awaits, or however we want to imagine that.
Oh, that's very well said. I'm curious, is that the kind of golden thread from modernism that you find applying in the world of therapy today? And are there others?
Yeah. I think for me, therapy is really aided by literature, particularly poetry. And so there are some poets who write in a deeply psychological way, like Wallace Stevens, or I think he's probably the one that comes most to mind. W.H. Auden is another one. Sylvia Plath, and so this kind of literature, this literature of poetry, and we get very close now in terms of poetry to mythopoetry, and mythopoesis, and poetry. The word itself means to make, to create, and so what we're creating is another way of seeing, another way of understanding, and shifting that perspective from this to this can make all the difference in the world to how we understand our own suffering, how we understand our own strengths, how we understand our own families, which is always the big challenge of therapy. Most of adult life is about overcoming childhood. So
and I'm wondering, the shifting of perspective, that occurs in myth, in poetry, in therapy. I'm wondering about the shifting of perspective, and then the sharing of the shift, right? Like how do you see that figuring in?
Yeah, I think again, there's always this moment in poetry, and I think this is always true in myth too. There's always a moment where there's a distinct shift in narrative form or in perspective. And that shift is always a shift into some kind of deeper awareness. I wish I had it in front of me, but Billy Collins wrote a poem. It's a marvelous poem about, and the title is "Another Reason I Don't Keep a Gun in the House." And it's about the neighbor's dog that's barking and barking and barking, and he won't stop barking. And so what happens at this shift, Collins is writing, and he says, "And now," and he tells us he's imagining the dog as a part of an orchestra. And there he is in the back row of the orchestra, his head held high, and he's barking, barking, barking. And he wraps up the poem by saying that this is the great performance, or something like that, of Beethoven's famous barking dog coda, and it's just a marvelous way to reimagine how that barking is affecting you. So this movement happens in myth all the time. It is kind of a fundamental mythopoetic movement, and we find it in literature, we find it in film, we find it in myth, and we find it in art.
It reminds me of what Catherine Svela shared on the last webinar. She talked about making the turn, right? And she was coming from her perspective as a mythologist, as an artist and an artist. But that phrase, make the turn, that's resonating in my mind with the shift. The shift.
Yeah, I think that's true. I think that's a good way to look at it. It is a turn of sorts, and culture has always depended on these turns. The turn to linguistics, the turn to metaphysics, and when we start to see the world, or we start to see through the world as a species, or at least we start to question it, right? And we have this vague intimation or intuition that something is going on behind this material presence. So these turns are always they're always difficult because it's always swimming upstream, but they always have this extraordinary payoff if we can hang with them
and share them.
Yeah, and that's that's kind of the foundation of myth too, is this shared experience, the story that's told at the end of the day, or around the campfire, or whatever, that shared experience.
Absolutely. There's almost a sense in which it's not a story until it's told, right? Like once someone hears it, that's like the circuit closing.
Yeah, and I think speaking it does something, and this is why therapy is so powerful. Talk therapy is that you speak this story, and there's something about speaking it that changes it, and it changes our experience of it. As a writer, I'm aware all the time that I can never get anything to live on a page the way it lives in my head. And speaking it invites a response from the story itself. The story has its own agenda sometimes.
Absolutely.
And the only way it can insert its agenda into that imaginal image is through speaking it. Otherwise, it stays hermetically sealed up here somehow. And
yeah, that's such a great image. Letting the story speak by speaking it, right? Like giving voice to the story in order to let the story's voice out.
Yeah.
So would love to talk a little more about your experience of working with the book, of working with Pathways. So you spent a lot of time with this book, right, in order to write this book. and would love to hear what that was like for you, from your unique perspective, to kind of go back to Pathways to Bliss and really spend some time with it, if you'd like to share anything about that.
Yeah, I think I would. I mean, let me add one more thing about modernism and psychology. Psychology is a modernist invention. Freud writes Interpretation of Dreams, in 1900, 4 years before Campbell was born. And up until then, psychology was mostly physiologically based and experimental. Freud opens up again this interior space. So I just wanted to mention that psychology is itself a kind of product of modernism. My experience working with this book was, I was very pleased that this was the book that I had the chance to write the study guide to, because it is, I think, probably the most psychological of all the Campbell books. He spends a lot of time with psychological theory and with Jung and Freud, and also the idea of personal mythology, which is another, I think, really important notion. So it was a pleasure to be able just to take time and not just read through, but to read and think about what I'd been reading and what were the implications of what I'm reading. And some of the things that I write about in the Skeleton Key Guide are those rabbit holes that opened up, and it becomes extraordinarily interesting, for me, when for instance, when Campbell is talking about Hamlet and Hamlet's Oedipal relationship to his mother. He makes a statement, and he attributes it to Freud, and he calls this the Hamlet posture. Now, that's nothing I've ever heard of before, and I can't find it in any of Freud's writing. And I'm pretty confident Freud never said anything remotely close to that. And
maybe
so
Campbell dreamed that Freud said that.
yeah. But it opens up an interesting train of thought for Campbell on this issue, and I think that's what the interesting thing is. It's not about, well, do we have to remain kind of these dogmatic adherents? I mean, this is part of Campbell understanding Freud pretty well too, by the way, and he's working it over in his own mind. He's making this information that he's absorbed his own. And so what comes out of that is the Hamlet posture. But again, Hamlet couldn't kill Claudius, his uncle, according to Freud, because Claudius had done what Hamlet wanted to do. So he identified too much with him, which was murdering his own father. And so Hamlet's inability to act came from that paralysis of Claudius having done what he unconsciously wanted to do, and therefore identified with him so much that he couldn't kill him. It's fascinating. And Freud, throughout the collected or the standard edition of Freud, he brings up Shakespeare all the time. Shakespeare was a great favorite of Freud's.
Fascinating.
So it was fun to just have this time to spend with this book, and then to have to go through the act of writing about it. It changes how the book lives in me, and so that was a kind of unexpected boon to it.
Well, and it kind of goes back to what we were talking about. It sounds like there was a shift in you, and then you shared that shift by writing it down, and now here it is. So anyone can participate in that shift that you experienced because you shared it. So thank you for doing that work on behalf of everyone who reads it. And I do have a couple more questions. I know I want to leave time to go to questions from the Q&A as well. So just a couple more questions. Do you have a favorite quote from Pathways?
Yeah, my favorite quote is
not pick one.
I think my favorite quote is where Campbell's talking about the hero's journey and the rewarding aspect of that. He says, but there's always the possibility of fiasco. And I love that, because he doesn't say failure. He doesn't say disappointment. He doesn't say, pain or heartbreak. He says fiasco.
Which is kind of a narrative term, right? Like the story of your life
is.
could have trouble and it could have bliss too.
It locates life firmly in the realm of comedy. You know, and comedy, of course, is that literary genre that it simply means everything works out okay in the end.
Mm-hmm.
So you can have all kinds of comedy. You can have purgatorial comedy like Dante and the Inferno and all of that. But what Campbell is saying is that life is a comedy. It's a play. It's a game, and there can be fiasco, but there doesn't have to be this despair.
So that leads me to very nicely, again, thank you, to my last question, which is, do you have a wish for readers of the study guide or any final advice before we go to the Q&As coming in?
I think my hope is that that readers will read this book and they will understand what it means to have a personal mythology. And rather than just choosing these archetypal images that appeal to them or they aspire to, they can see more clearly the archetypal realities that are working in them and on them. I think that moving the understanding of personal mythology away from this kind of parlor game thing into this really deeply meaningful exploration of the self is, I think, probably the one thing I would wish for people.
Oh, thank you. I'm gonna participate in that wish selfishly for, for myself, understanding more the deep reality of what it means to have a personal mythology. Thank you. Thank you so much, Brad. So everyone, let's hear it in the chat for Brad. And now is the time for the Q&A portion of our webinar today. So everyone, if you have any questions you'd like us to address, put them into that Q&A. Click the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen and type them in. And Stephen, we will hand the microphone to you. What questions do we have coming in?
All right, we have several interesting questions, and most of them, well, more are coming in, but most seem to have a little bit of a practical bent to them. The first question is by someone named Anonymous, who is my favorite author of quotes on the internet. This attendee asks, in this world where some groups seek to make mythology and belief and bliss irrelevant, keeping people overly anchored in earthly matters 24/7, how can people such as those here at JCF and through this material particularly help others who think all is lost find their place and understand that matter is not everything, but just a form under the rule of time?
Well, that's the big challenge. That's often the result of the hero's journey, is arriving at that understanding. This is bliss is a problematic word. It's got a little bit of baggage because it comes from Old English and Old Saxon words that mean things like merriment and gaiety and things like that. And so when we talk about bliss, that's often something that's profoundly misunderstood. And famously, Campbell once said that maybe I should have said, "Follow your blisters." But bliss is really what we're talking about here is the sublime. And we talk about the sublime, we're talking about something that has the element of terror attached to it. Kant writes about, I know Mark Peterson is out there. I saw him earlier. And here's a shout out to you, Mark. Kant talks about the sublime in the Critique of Judgment. And the sublime has these qualities of magnitude and force. And it's so powerful, it's overwhelming to experience it. It is also unfathomable. You can't wrap your mind around it. It's immense. And so there's this sort of interpenetration that eventually happens, as we're kind of reaching into it, it's reaching into us. and eventually there's this kind of equilibration that's created, and so this terror then is part of what helps us transform experiences into into an aesthetic experience, into beauty. And the poet Shelley said that the sublime makes us forsake the easy for the harder pleasures. And so I think, that's what we encounter in myth all the time, is we encounter the sublime. And I do think that's what Campbell might have meant by bliss.
In fact, frankly, I never quite had a handle on the sublime until I heard Joseph Campbell discuss it with Bill Moyers. I'm going to bounce around a little bit because I noticed two questions that are relatively short, but on the same subject. Bonnie Benetato, and I apologize if I've mispronounced your name. I love the alliteration. Ask if you could elaborate on personal mythology and Zuzu along the same line. What do you mean by personal mythology, and how can it be cultivated for our lives?
Personal mythology is, I think it's what we have left, because we don't have a unifying mythology anymore. We're too many, we're too diverse, we're scattered all around, and so there can't be one unifying mythologic theme. Now, Campbell says as much in several places. He talks about, we stand on the ground of a terminal moraine, he called it, of broken symbolic images. And I think that there isn't currently a myth that adequately conveys the experience of living. And so we're sort of left with the first and the fourth function of myth, that Campbell described, the first function being to create awe at the mystery of existence in the universe, and the fourth function is the psychological function. The science and socio-political realities have overtaken the second and the function myth, and so that's no longer thought about in mythic terms. We don't have laws anymore that are by divine fiat or handed down, on tablets directly from God. So what we're left with basically is a personal experience of myth. And this has to be a deeply psychological process. It makes you ideally look at the patterns in your life that keep recurring, that you look at the nature of your relationships. You explore your own emotional relationships to the world, and you find those expressions in myth. The expression of humanity in myth is enormous and quite varied, and so you can, if you happen to be a villain, you'll certainly find yourself in myth. If you happen to be a priest, you'll find yourself there. There's all these places, but there has to be this kind of open, honest self-evaluation as you enter into it, so that you're not just playing a game with yourself that's comforting and soothing and tells you that you're perfectly okay when maybe you're not, and maybe there are things that need to be changed in your life.
Beautiful answer. On a difficult subject, frankly, what is personal mythology? There are several other brilliant questions here, but I'm going to bounce down to one that's not specifically about pathways to bliss, but is interesting and is often ignored. And this is from Noble from Ghana. I came to Joseph Campbell after I picked up Myths to Live By, which is one of my favorite intros, by the way, to Joseph Campbell's work to give to people. Picked up Myths to Live By at my university bookstore as an undergraduate. I was studying chemistry at the University of Ghana. I have loved and followed Campbell's work ever since. But I wanted to know if Campbell has explored African mythology in any of his works, because what colonialism did in Africa is to destroy our myths. And I've always been interested in recovering what was lost. So I thought I'd bounce that over to you, and I have some thoughts too on this. What comes to your mind, Brad?
Wow, that's an amazing question. Africa is a fascinating thing for me to think about. Africa seems to have been relegated to the deep unconscious, at least in the Western world. We don't give a great deal of consideration to Africa, and it's sort of Oedipal in a way, isn't it? I mean, it's the place we all come from, and yet we pay no mind to it, and we don't find it to be important in the Western world. But it's an incredibly rich place. I think, Stephen, you can help me on this. I don't think Campbell addresses Africa directly.
And
I think maybe in primitive mythology, he writes a bit about.
He definitely touches on it, jumps into it somewhat there, and he's also fond of Leo Frobenius, who can be identified with the colonial powers in some ways there. But when Joe started writing the Historical Atlas of World Mythology, which is his comprehensive work, that the first 2 volumes came out in 5 parts, and he never did finish it. He got just partway through it at the time that he passed. When he first started writing that, way back in the early 70s, his thought, it was a whole different schematic he had in mind than how the work ended up. He started, let me just address these things continent by continent. So he started with Africa and wrote and wrote and wrote and wrote, and then realized this is never ever going to be published if I'm going through this piece by piece. So he switched. He came up with a schematic that he used. But my understanding, and I haven't dived into the archives recently, but that there is material about Africa in there, and that Campbell was doing a lot of work in that area and definitely felt it was neglected. But to find out, in his published work and in his lectures, references to African myths, you have to kind of dig through it all. It's like finding the needle in the haystack. So perhaps we might want to do a dive at some point in the future in the archives and see what we can pull up about that material, because so much of what was going into the historical atlas never saw the light of day.
Yeah.
There's also, I would love to lift up a book called The Hero with an African Face by Ford. Which is very much, building on Campbell's work and carrying the conversation forward, which is something that I hope everyone does. Campbell didn't end the conversation. Campbell did a lot to begin the conversation of mythological studies for us today. And so that's a great work. And also Dr. Fanny Brewster has 2 books out from a more Jungian perspective. I think one just came out just like a month ago, Race and the Unconscious. And the other one is called The Racial Complex. Wonderful books.
Fantastic. I love those resources, especially The Hero with an African Face. Marvelous work there. I'm bouncing back up to a question from Kristen Heim. a big picture, more empirical question. To what extent do you think mythological thinking, in quotation marks, is proliferating across people, across cultures? Is there presently an interest? What does it look like? And relatedly, is there an easy way to make this approachable to the average Joe?
Well, yes and no. I think that what we've got here is, the message of myth consists of material that's oral or written, consists of art and photography, cinema, music, all of that, etc. That has some ability to communicate messages. Now, the message of myth is signifying a particular state of consciousness with which one may then explore and discuss and enter into or dissect without attending to substance. Now, and what we're then exploring, if we're not attending to substance, it doesn't mean substance isn't important. What it means is that we're not getting stuck on the literal quality of the story that we're hearing. And we can move into questioning, what does this mean? Now, we often will ask ourselves that question of life: what does this mean? But we don't ask it seriously often, where we really consider, what are the possibilities here? What are behind these images that I'm witnessing or interacting with? Or, what is this business of human relationship? And what is my relationship to the natural world? And all of those questions start to be unpacked with this. Now, the form of myth insists on metaphor. You can't have myth without metaphor. Myth is fundamentally metaphor. And metaphor has plastic, flexible, mercurial, non-literal communications and styles and forms and images. And they help us to explore those questions that, I'm trying to think, how did Wittgenstein put it? I think he said that even when all possible scientific questions have been answered, the problems of life remain completely untouched. And so those things that are kind of unreachable from a material, objective perspective, we can start to have some kind of interaction with. I don't know that we understand them. I don't know that we finally come to any kind of objective conclusion about them, but it puts us in relationship with them, and then we wrestle with them, and this wrestling with it is really the important part. This is Aeschylus saying, we suffer our way into truth.
So many more questions. We're not going to get to even a fraction of them, and I feel kind of bad because I'm the gatekeeper, picking and choosing. Maybe
no,
one.
no, no. No feeling bad, Stephen. You're doing
Very
great.
cool. Well, I'm feeling bad. I feel I have to say that, so I feel bad about having to say I feel bad. Here's one from, and I'm picking this because you are, because of your day job, Brad. This is from Monica in Brazil. Brad, thank you so much for your talk. As a Jungian analyst, do you think it more difficult to help people address Campbell's Follow Your Bliss nowadays than it used to be in Campbell's time?
I don't know. That's a really good. Hi, Monica, by the way. That's a hard question for me. I don't know. I really don't know. In Campbell's time, Campbell was here. So I think that made it easier. And so you get it right from the horse's mouth. And when you listen to for the Pathways podcast, I listened to all kinds of Campbell lectures, and the question and answer sessions that we often use for the bonus sessions are really extraordinary, because you get to hear him kind of extemporaneously address those very kinds of issues, and it's really lovely to hear that. But I don't know. I think, in certainly in the 70s and 80s, when I was a lad, I think there was a countercultural movement that Stephen remembers and still is a part
Embraces?
of. Where that was kind of the overriding ethos, trying to see through the institutional structures of life and the limitations of political systems and sort of things.
Of course, one difference now versus in Joe's time is that Follow Your Bliss hadn't become a meme yet. It hadn't been embraced by popular culture. So as you point out, you're getting it from the horse's mouth. Today, it's a term that comes with so much baggage that it requires a little bit of tutorial, follow your bliss, which you could say is follow your rapture. What I liked about how Joe, before he discovered the phrase follow your bliss, he would often say, follow your enthusiasms, which is so cool because that's from the Latin en theos, the divine aspect, if you will. Yeah, hard to answer that question though, and hard to answer anymore because the clock seems to be right around 11.
We are at time. Thank you so much. And what a great question to end on, though. Follow your bliss. It obviously works as a catchphrase, and it bears contemplation as well, and conversation. And I look forward to many more conversations here on Joseph Campbell webinars about that very topic. Thank you so much, Stephen, and thank you, Brad. Let's hear another round of applause in the chat for Brad and for Stephen. And I am going to share my slides again, just very quickly as we wrap up here. I say that, and then here we go. It's happening. Okay, so this is the promo code that we promised you. Now, the promo code is all caps, My Pathway. And this code is good for the next 2 weeks on the Joseph Campbell site only. It's not good on Amazon or anyplace else. You got to go to jcf.org to the shop for this code to work. And when you put in that code, you get the bundle of the Pathways to Bliss study guide and Pathways to Bliss itself. Both ebooks are $9.99 with that bundle. And purchases on jcf.org are 100% tax deductible and go directly to supporting the work of the foundation, for which we are very grateful. And I think if it hasn't happened already, I think Dylan is going to drop the link to that e-bundle into the chat. Okay, before we wrap up, one final thing. The 4th Skeleton Key Study Guide is now available. I am holding it in my hands. It is for Campbell's book, The Flight of the Wild Gander, and it's by Dr. Evans Lansing Smith, or Lance for short. And you can register now for our next study group webinar, where we'll be able to talk to Lance for a little bit. The webinar is on September 30th. So mark your calendar and go to jcf.org/study guides to register. And I think Dylan can drop that link in the chat as well. Thank you so much for joining us today. And a big thank you to Brad and Stephen and Dylan and Stephanie. We will leave the webinar open for a few minutes so that you can wrap up any conversations that you have going in the chat and copy out any links that you need. And I hope you enjoy the Pathways to Bliss study guide. Post your reviews on Amazon and social media. And most of all, I hope you join us for the next webinar. Have a great day.